Recently, Christian philosopher William Lane Craig did a video with right-wing commentator Ben Shapiro where William Lane Craig discussed atheist arguments. He responded to them, so I thought it would be good to respond to the responses. There will be a lot of responding in this video. So let's check this video of them out and see what we can do with it.
Talk about a couple of those philosophy arguments from 101 that are constantly trotted out. I've had similar experiences. The most common one that I've heard, of course, is the problem of evil, the suggestion that how can God be good if so much evil takes place in the world? Yeah. The more sophisticated version of the argument to me is not the problem of human evil, which seems pretty easily disposable, but
Well, I would disagree that it is pretty easily disposable. The fact that it's still an outstanding question after 2,000 years of Christianity should be telling, but let's continue.
Problem of natural evil things happening to children, a child with cancer. How does a good God rule over a world in which children die of natural causes, in which kids are born with Tay-Sachs, in which horrible things happen to good people?
Yes. In dealing with this problem, I think it's really important that we distinguish between what I call the intellectual problem of evil and the emotional problem of evil. There is no...
Already splitting it up. I like that. I do like nuance, so let's give him some credit for the nuance aspect, although I'm sure he's going to do some shady stuff with it here in a moment.
No doubt that emotionally, the evil and suffering in the world make it very difficult to believe in God. It's a tremendous emotional obstacle. But intellectually, considered dispassionately as a philosophical problem, it's extraordinarily difficult to show that there's either any inconsistency or improbability between the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God and the evil and suffering in the world.
Well, this is not like a Star Trek situation where there's like a prime directive of not interfering with developing cultures before they reach a certain level. This is very different. We're talking about a God who is the creator of the universe and can therefore actually stop all evils. The Star Trek thing, obviously, they're worried about influencing a culture in a negative way. With God, it seems very different because God's intervention would be a wholly positive thing if he were to intervene in a culture that has, for example, child marriages, or let's say a geographic area that has been heavily polluted and therefore has a higher amount of, let's say, childhood leukemias. These are very different circumstances, and I think to sort of take this kind of prime directive view on it is very silly, personally.
The atheist would have to show that it is either impossible or improbable that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the natural and moral evil in the world. And how could he possibly show that? We're simply not in a position to make those kind of probability judgments.
I disagree. Here's why I disagree on a personal level, which is I am not the most loving person to ever exist. I can actually have quite the deficit there. I'm not the most empathetic person to exist either. And we are told that God, if he does exist, is going to be extremely empathetic and extremely loving, much more than any human. I, personally, would not let something like the Holocaust happen. I would stop it if I had the power. That kind of suffering is unjustifiable. There is no plan that justifies that kind of suffering in the world. I have a friend who recently lost her husband to a brain tumor. They have a small child. I could not bear to let this happen to a family like this. But in our world, it just happens. And I think that when we consider the issue of God, his character matters. If your God is infinitely loving and infinitely empathetic, then evil in the world, at least a certain kind of evil, I think we can say God should intervene, but does not seem to intervene in the world. I mean, there's all kinds of evils in the world where God should intervene if he exists, hypothetically. Let's say even the most extreme cases. Let's say the brain tumor thing is not worthy of intervention for some reason, even though I would think it is. Still, the Holocaust would be, the Rwandan genocide. These would be interventionist situations. From my own perspective, as a vaguely empathetic and loving person, I think it's sort of unjustifiable to say that God is all loving and all empathetic if he does not seem to actually show it.
With any confidence. And so I think that the problem of evil, as difficult as it may be emotionally, intellectually, it lays a burden of proof on the shoulders of the atheist, which is so heavy that it has proved to be unsustainable.
It hasn't proved to be unsustainable because the problem of evil does bring a lot of people out of Christianity and other religions and make them atheists. And not just for emotional reasons. I don't know if, like, for Bart Ehrman it's emotional, for example. I think he has serious intellectual problems with the problem of evil. I mean, obviously I have a lot of, like, emotional problems with it. But intellectually, it's hard to justify the existence of a creator God who is loving and kind and yet lets these things happen that surely none of us lesser beings would let happen if we had the power. Before we move on, I should also say I do find it very suspect that he would try to separate these into intellectual and emotional arguments without actually fully explaining what makes the intellectual argument that different from the emotional argument. They seem to play into each other. If we use a pure logic position, then I would say, no, there is no reason why God has to intervene in the world unless he meets certain characteristics. Characteristics which William Lane Craig believes God does indeed meet. So the intellectual-emotional distinction here, I'm not convinced of. I just recorded 30 minutes of video on mute. Let's make sure it's okay. It's not muted this time. Let's try this again, and hopefully I do better with less shock, because believe you me, some of this is about to get shocking.
Sustainable.
And these days, the other argument that is brought up in enormous amounts is the supposed backwardness of the Bible itself and biblical morality. This happens largely with regard to, for example, homosexual marriage.
Gay marriage is, fun fact, not mentioned at all in the Bible.
It's been brought up with regard to abortion, which I think is more, again, easily disposable, because I think there's a solid secular argument in favor of the protection of human life.
And yet, the main people on the pro-life side are Christians and religious people, and the main people on the pro-choice side tend to be of a more secular, if not outright atheistic persuasion. And yes, there are secular arguments in favor of banning abortion. There are secular arguments in favor of a whole lot of, like, negative stuff. But the fact that there are arguments don't make them good, compelling, or convincing arguments. Arguments that really have staying power, which is why most atheists leave Christian morality behind, find their own morality, and decide, hey, abortion should be legal.
But homosexual marriage is the one that most often comes up. You also hear arguments that the Bible permits slavery. So if the Bible...
It does, and not only permits, but encourages. They like to dance around these sorts of issues, but let's not forget that the Israelites were encouraged to take slaves after genociding entire peoples.
was so wonderful, then why are there all these weird sections of the Bible where it talks about wiping peoples from the earth, where it talks about...
Yeah, again, good point. Why is that there?
Where it talks about enslaving other human beings. Some things that we would certainly consider moral evils today are contemplated by the Bible and not banned by the Bible. So why is that?
Well, let me address briefly first this question of slavery. When we hear the word slavery, Ben, we think of slavery as it existed in the American South.
I think things are about to take a very strange turn, so stay tuned.
And as you know, that is nothing like the system that existed in ancient Israel. In ancient Israel, there was no social safety net sponsored by the state. There was no poverty program. So if a man got himself into a situation where he couldn't pay his debts, he could keep his family together and retain his self-respect by selling himself as an indentured servant.
I don't think a person could keep self-respect by becoming a slave. Now, indentured servitude is a type of slavery, and it is, like all the other types of slavery, something we look down upon. Let's not lose sight of that fact. He's trying to justify Israelite slavery by saying it was indentured servitude. Don't worry, it was just indentured servitude, which we know today, at least most of us, is wrong, because we have enough empathy to recognize its wrongness. And they're going to dance around like this and ignore, or try to, the elephant in the room, which is, again, the Israelites wiping out entire peoples and taking the scattered remnants as slaves, not indentured servants, as slaves, for which there is no prohibition in the Bible, and instead only encouragement.
To his creditor until he could work off his debts and then he would have to be set free. After 7 years, he had to be set free in any case.
Well, I feel a lot better now, don't you?
So this was really a form of indentured servanthood. It wasn't slavery as we think of that term.
Indentured servitude is slavery.
This was actually an anti-poverty program. And
Oh, you see, it's just like welfare. You see, it's just like welfare.
in some respects, I think it's better than what we have.
Hold up, better than what we have. So he thinks the social safety net should be replaced by slavery. That's not my words. He just said it. He just said that, and he's about to say more. If you don't believe me that he just said it, watch this.
In modern Western culture, which destroys families, ruins people's self-respect because they're not working. Whereas in ancient Israel, a man retained his self-respect, he worked for an income, he paid his debts, he kept his family together. And that, to call that slavery is just a gross misrepresentation.
How do you say this shit with a straight face? How do you say this sort of thing and not realize what you're saying and how absolutely garish and unhinged it really is? I am perplexed and disturbed and indeed horrified by the statements he is making right now. I think if he could get outside of himself and see this as we are currently seeing this, he would also be horrified to find himself making these kinds of statements.
Now, the first thing you mentioned, I've forgotten.
Homosexual marriage,
Yeah,
same-sex
okay.
marriage.
With respect to some of these other moral questions, I think we need to remember the first premise of the moral argument. If there is no God, then there are no objective moral values.
Moral values don't have to be objective to make sense for our world, for the society we live in. Something doesn't have to be objective to be essentially correct as we understand it. Now, he's about to make an argument, as these types of people usually do, that atheists have no objective moral things to base themselves on, and Christians and religious people do. But let's remember something about who we're dealing with here. William Lane Craig believes that God is a cosmic judge. God is a cosmic judge. He is the creator of all things, and his standards are the only thing that matters. So if God says, "Thou shalt not kill," but then demands you to genocide an entire people, it is moral to genocide an entire people. He has said as much before as it regards the Canaanites. He has said that the Israelites genociding the Canaanites was A-okay because God demanded it, and God is the final judge. That is not objective morality. That is saying, objectively, it is right to follow whatever the God of the Bible says. But the morals he lays out are not objective because they have so many caveats and exceptions and exemptions that really, a lot of the time, people don't even have to follow these laws.
And duties, everything is socioculturally relative. So who's to say that the more
Everything is relative anyway. I don't see either of these guys, one of whom believes in the Bible, which includes the Old Testament, or the other guy, which believes in, well, I guess, not just what Christians call the Old Testament. Religiously, Jewish people have other books. There's other books in Judaism, other traditions. But in the end, they do both believe in this same set of origin stories, which encourages the stoning of gay people. And yet, neither one of these people would encourage the stoning of gay people. Neither one of them would pass laws encouraging the stoning of gay people. But yet, because the Bible says it is wrong, they'll ban gay marriage, which I don't think you should do in a secular society. If you want to have a theocratic society, well, sure, do whatever you want, I guess. I mean, if it's going to be a theocratic society, I guess you can do that. But in a secular society, where rules are not based on religion, you're going to need better reasons than religion to say gay marriage should not be allowed. For example, there are other examples we could use.
moral values of a society that discriminates against people and oppresses people is worse than one which is liberal and tolerant. We just sort of assume.
It's empathy. Empathy is the missing ingredient here. You wouldn't want people to be mean to you if you were gay, and so you shouldn't be mean to gay people. If you were gay, you'd want to be able to get married. So you should want gay people to be able to get married. That's how empathy works. That's not an objective, subjective, moral thing. That's just basic human empathy and decency, something Christians very often seem to be lacking in.
That the liberal values are the ones that would be objective, when in fact they're just as relativistic as any of the other ones on atheism.
I don't think the reason that biblical morality is wrong is because I have a grasp on objective morality that's better than the Bible. I think it's wrong because I have empathy and I love other people, and I see where the Bible comes into strong and heavy conflict with that. For me, it's not a question of subjective morality, objective morality. It's not even really a question of morality. It's not a question of right and wrong. It's a question of doing the right thing or the wrong thing. And for me, doing the right thing or wrong thing comes down to the ways in which we treat other people. I think Christianity is wrong. I think all religion is wrong. Would I ban it? No. Would I stop people from going to church? No. Would I stop people from praying? No. Would I try to stamp out religion if I had the power? No. The reason for that is I have empathy. I know if I were a religious person, I would not want to be stomped out like that. I would not want to be stamped out. I would not want to have my whole life treaded on like that. So I don't want to tread on theirs. But they can't seem to extend it the other way as it regards gay people, trans people, stuff like that.
So if we need God to be the anchor point for objective moral values and duties, we cannot escape the question, when thinking of moral right and wrong, well, what does God think of this?
Many different things at many different times. Thou shalt not kill. Then Moses comes down from the mountain and kills thousands. Thou shalt not kill except for the Canaanites. Thou shalt not kill. Take out the Philistines. Over and over we see this kind of thing happening in the Bible. God's values are indeed very relative. Your only objectivity here is following that person in the ways he goes about doing things, which are very, very relativist and constantly changing, despite the fact the Bible says that God doesn't change.
And if God proscribes something, it seems to me that's entirely within his right. If God were to say, thou shalt not eat beans, or thou shalt not eat pork, that would be our moral duty.
Funnily enough, God did say you shouldn't eat pork, and I doubt William Lane Craig holds to that, although I think Ben Shapiro probably does.
And we should obey it. That is his prerogative.
See, the thing is, God is not the President of the United States. God is not my congressional representative. God is not my senator. God is not the Constitution of the United States. The Bible is also not the Constitution of the United States. The United States is a secular country. We are not to be ruled over by religious demagogues. We are not to be ruled over by the laws of a God that many of us do not believe in. We are a secular society, and our laws and rules should be based in secularism.
The moral lawgiver and the supreme good. And so if God says, my plan for human sexuality is heterosexual marriage, that's his prerogative. And there is no basis.
And if he exists and says that, he has no right to force that on other people. Christians talk a big game about choice, but they sure don't seem to want us to have it, do they?
For calling that, I think, into question.
So let's talk about the evolution of morality. And I want to go back to slavery for just a second. So it is true that Hebrew enslavement, that Jewish enslavement of others is really more indentured servitude. I mean, there's a whole section in, I believe it's Numbers or Leviticus, I think it's Leviticus maybe, where it speaks to specifically about the slave who doesn't want to leave, and you're supposed to pierce his ear on the doorpost as a punishment for him not wanting to leave and all of this.
Perfectly reasonable stuff, huh? How are you going to justify that? Well, he's not.
But by the same token, enslavement of people who are not inside the Israelite, inside the Jewish kind of tradition, that's not proscribed. So the idea of war captives is obviously taken into account and not banned. So certain things are banned in the Bible, certain things are not banned. Now, the way that biblical believers have practiced over time is that very early in the church's history, they're already starting to eliminate slavery, although not for people who are captured.
And yet, slavery continued in Christian societies for literally over 1,000 years after that. I mean, honestly, close to 2,000 years after that. So I don't think we can say that Christianity alone was enough to stop slavery.
And over time, the West is the first place to eliminate slavery altogether, specifically citing the sections of the Bible that talk about human freedom and the innate value of every human being.
Everybody at that point in time, the point of abolition in these respective countries was Christian. They all justified things using the Bible because it turns out you can read pretty much whatever the hell you want to in the Bible. It's a very vague and non-specific book for the most part, so you can find whatever it is you want to find in there. Now, the fact that they used the Bible to justify it does not mean that it was always there. In fact, at the same time people were using the Bible to justify abolition and the ending of slavery, there were people arguing the exact opposite using the same book. For that matter, even after slavery into the Jim Crow era, they were still using the Bible to say that the Jim Crow measures against black people and white people mixing was based in the Bible, was based in biblical morality. Now, of course, there are people like Martin Luther King who went up against that and ended up winning against it. But they did use that argument, and I've still heard people use those sorts of arguments, that the races shouldn't mix because the Bible says so. I've heard that from people today. And yes, it's completely disgusting, but that just goes to show that the Bible is not necessarily as clean-cut on these issues as they want to make it sound. The fact that Christians did something good does not mean that their book demands it, or that their book has essentially said this is how it should be. They read anti-slavery things into the Bible that, frankly, were not there at all.
So is that an evolution of morality, or is that a realization of a fundamental principle that was originally given to people who couldn't necessarily understand the full extent of the principle?
He wants to frame this as an issue of ignorance, as if ancient peoples were so ignorant they could not comprehend the abolition of slavery. Well, not every ancient society had slavery. Most of them did, but not all of them did. It was not everywhere all the time. And the fact that the ancient Jewish people could be convinced to cut off their foreskins tells me, you know, they were a lot more open-minded to things than you might have imagined. Literally, a key part of being a Jewish person in the ancient world was not having foreskin. It was kind of like a defining thing. You would take your baby and have the foreskin cut off. You're telling me that God could convince people to do that, but not that slavery was wrong? I don't buy that.
I think it's the latter, and I love the way you put it. I think that's nicely put. Jesus said something very much like this with respect to Old Testament regulations on divorce. They asked him whether or not it was lawful to divorce a woman for any reason, and Jesus said, Moses allowed you to write a certificate of divorce, but it was not so from the beginning. And he cites then the creation story of Genesis, of Adam and Eve, and said, what God has put together, let not man put asunder.
That is an anti-divorce statement. Divorce is very often looked down upon in Christianity, and I think that we should talk about divorce for a second because of that. So, divorce, I don't think William Lane Craig thinks divorce should be illegal, even though you have Jesus here saying that it's not moral. And how he would justify that is by saying that divorce is fine if it's not a God-blessed and sanctioned marriage. So let's say you get married to somebody thinking the Lord told you to get married to that person, and then let's say they do things to your child, very bad things to your child that can land them in prison for a very long time and make them the most unpopular prisoner in prison. In that particular circumstance, I would say William Lane Craig, if he's being honest, would say a divorce is fine. It's the right thing to do in this situation. Likewise, if your partner is violently abusive, an alcoholic, I think William Lane Craig would say in this situation, divorce is perfectly fine. And the reason he would say that is because this whole marriage doesn't necessarily seem to have divine blessings upon it. But the big problem comes in, how do you know whether a relationship has divine blessings or not? Remember, these are the people who say that Donald Trump, I mean, not William Lane Craig, I don't think he said anything like this, but a lot of these people will say that Donald Trump is a very important but very imperfect servant of the Lord, just like King David. They'll make this King David comparison. Donald Trump is like King David. Now, again, I don't think William Lane Craig would make this comparison, but a lot of Christians do make this comparison. So even when it comes to the case of, let's say, you have a partner who has done terrible things to you or your child, you could just say the same thing about that relationship. Like, well, he's a very imperfect servant of the Lord, but he's the person you're meant to be with. So I think the Christian case for divorce is very strong, and I think the Christian case against divorce is very, very weak.
So what Jesus was saying there was that the law of Moses was a temporary prescription accommodating the hardness of heart of the people at the time, but it didn't represent the perfect will of God for human marriage, which was grounded in the creation story.
So how exactly do we determine when we have moved beyond the biblical text in terms of the evolution of that morality? When are we fulfilling a broader goal that was kind of held back by temporary constraints? And when are we moving utterly beyond it? And again,
I think Ben Shapiro is a very interesting person. I am not a big fan of his, but I gotta say, he has some pretty good chemistry with William Lane Craig here, and I appreciate how he's leading the discussion. But he's leading the discussion in a kind of very aggressive way. Like, he's basically pulling William Lane Craig where he wants him to go. And it's a very effective tactic because it does seem to really put William Lane Craig at the top of his game. It just so happens that throughout this video, the top of William Lane Craig's game has been utterly disgusting. In that regard, I think this whole interview is something of a failure, personally. But let's continue.
again, here I'm thinking of same-sex marriage. So when it comes to same-sex marriage, the argument is now being made by people in liberal churches, including Pete Buttigieg, who's running for president, that basically Jesus was seeking equal respect for everyone. He cared about the least of these, and that prescriptions on homosexuality were really more, and homosexual activity were not eternal precepts, but were really attempting to crack down on the promiscuity of the time, or they were temporary expedients.
See, here's something interesting I think you could also say about the Bible and its anti-gay stuff. Now, today in the West, we have a very modern idea of what it means to be a homosexual. A gay person, as it were, in today's society is someone who not only has sex with, but loves the same sex. Or gender, I suppose, if we're talking about trans people who are also gay. So anyway, what I'm saying is, we have a specific idea of what it means to be gay today. But if you go back to these ancient societies, the ideas that they had about things like sexuality, including same-sex sexuality, they're very different than what we have today. You didn't really have as many gay relationships back then like you have now. You didn't have the loving sort of partnership as much. It did exist. It did exist sometimes, even leading to marriage sometimes. But it was rare. A lot more common was like a dominating relationship, a relationship where one person was superior, one person was inferior, one person was domineering, asserting control, asserting their power and influence, and the other person was dehumanized. That is a very different context than gay relationships today, and one must consider that when in the Bible they talk about gay relationships, they're talking about something very different than what we have for today. So I do see the liberal Christians having a decent argument for their case. But if this rule against being gay came from God, presumably God was being inclusive of all forms of gayness, what they had back then and what we have now. Now, of course, I don't believe in God, so it doesn't matter to me. But I do think the ancients were talking about their idea of gay relationships, which are very different than ours today. But, you know, of course, religious people disagree, so I'm sure they disagree. Let's see what William has to say about all this.
Yeah, I think that's clearly false. When you look at these regulations, both in the Old Testament and then they're repeated in the New Testament in the strongest terms in Romans chapter 1.
Romans was the word of Paul, and Paul, fun fact, was not Jesus. Paul, fun fact, was not God. Paul had disagreements with practically everybody on everything. Jesus never said anything, not a single word, about gay people. When it comes down to it, if you're talking about Paul's letter to the Romans, or letters to the Romans, I guess, if you're talking about that stuff, you're talking about his opinions. You're not talking about things delivered to him from on high. You're talking about one man's opinions of things. So Paul obviously disagreed with like Peter and James on a lot of stuff, for example. They disagreed amongst themselves. None of them were receiving messages from God about what to do. They argued about it and argued about it and argued about it. Now, I'm sure Peter and James would have agreed with the ideas of Paul on this sort of thing. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, it doesn't matter because, again, Paul was speaking for himself from his own position. And I think we need to make that clear, but let's continue.
There's no doubt that Paul is thinking of this as a moral law that has abiding significance. And it's grounded again, I think, in the creation story, that God has created human sexuality, He's created man and woman in such a way that the fulfillment of that relationship will take place within the safety and security of a heterosexual marriage.
Anyway, I think we can call it there. There's not much more he has to say. I think that's good enough. This whole discussion was actually quite disturbing, in my opinion. And I think that it's underrated for its disturbingness. And I think a lot of Christians are going to have seen this and thought, well, he made some awesome arguments, some awesome points. But if you are not a Christian and you're watching this guy and hearing him say the things he's saying about slavery and indentured servitude, you are going to be rightfully horrified, and about slavery in general between the two of them. This whole thing is just disheartening. I hate to say it, but I have a relatively high opinion of William Lane Craig as a Christian philosopher. This video lowered it significantly, and that's unfortunate. Thankfully, my opinion of Ben Shapiro could not go much lower, so it did not. This is just what I would expect of him. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks for watching.